John G. Polzin is a distinguished past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Michigan, Free and Accepted Masons, having served in 1975 and 1976. John was born May 15, 1922, in Chicago, Illinois, to John B. and Audrey M. Polzin. He grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and served as a sergeant in the U.S. Army in World War II in the European theater. Returning to Kalamazoo, he graduated from Kalamazoo College in 1947. Following college and marriage, back in Kalamazoo, John joined with his father in the National Products Company, producing flavoring for the baking, ice cream, and confectionery industries. John joined Freemasonry in Anchor Lodge of Strict Observance in 1953 and was its worshipful master in 1960. He was called into the service of the Grand Lodge of Michigan in 1969 and served as the Most Worshipful Grand Master in 1975 and 1976. Let's listen to that interview.
All right, John, let's start at the beginning and tell us where you were born.
Well, I was born in Chicago, Illinois. However, my parents were living at that time in Benton Harbor, fairly newlyweds. I think it was about a year and a half or two I appeared. But in those days, the reason it was in Chicago is that in those days, it was fairly common for the mother to be around at the time of the birthing of the little baby. And in probably that generation, you married within your own community. In this case, my dad had married a Chicago girl, although he was from Grand Rapids, but he was living, because his job called for it, in Benton Harbor, and so my mother went home to be with her mother for my birth. So that's how it happened to be in Chicago.
Very good. So you ended up in Michigan then because your father was originally from here?
Yes, my father was with Washburn Crosby Company, which was the old gold medal flour company prior to it becoming part of General Mills, and he was a flour salesman calling on bakeries, primarily bakeries, and maybe some wholesale grocers for gold medal flour.
When did you end up in Kalamazoo?
Well, his territory was such that Kalamazoo would be more centrally located. He had much of the state of Michigan and I think probably from the Lake Shore over to Jackson or so. So he moved to Kalamazoo.
How old were you at that time?
I was in diapers. I don't quite remember that.
So you grew up in the Kalamazoo area?
So I grew up in the Kalamazoo area. Mm-hmm.
Okay, where'd you go to school?
Well, I started in kindergarten at the training school. What is now Western Michigan University was Western State Teachers College at that time, and they had a training school for teachers, of which was considered more or less of a better school than the general public schools, because these were practicing teachers on teaching new methods and of teaching, and I was there through fourth grade, and then we moved to a different part of town, and then I started at the public schools in fifth grade, and then went on to junior high school and through high school.
What high school did you go to?
The only high school in Kalamazoo, Kalamazoo Central.
Oh, that was the only high school at the time?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your parents.
Well, again, my mother was a Chicago girl, and she was very lovely, as we think of our mothers, you know. She was 5'9", and as a consequence, really, she was quite a striking woman when she was dressed up in full regalia, and and awfully nice mother, and I remember I was an only child, so she read to me a lot and hovered over me almost all my life. My father was Grand Rapids, and he had been in World War I and had come back and gotten a job with the Washburn Crosby Company, and originally he was just working with grocery stores and promoting gold medal flour, and then he was, in a sense, promoted to doing the wholesale larger quantities, and there were lots of bakeries. I think at that time, Grand Rapids had, even I remember, Grand Rapids had something like 50 retail bakeries. And so southwestern Michigan had a lot of bakeries, and it's hard to believe that you didn't have wholesale bread trucked around. Instead, it was made by local bakeries, and that's where you bought your bread. And many of those bakeries bought carloads, that is a boxcar load, of flour, and would use that. And there were two bakeries in the little town of Cassopolis, and I think there were two, they were both 6 carload buyers a year of flour.
That's a lot of flour.
Yeah.
What are some of your most vivid childhood memories? What do you remember the most about growing up in Kalamazoo?
Well, after we moved from what were the Marlboro apartments there, we did a lot of moving because particularly after we ran into the Depression. But I remember that one still stands out with me, that I was rather afraid where we moved to Old Orchard Place. There was a lady that had a hat that almost looked like a woven basket, and she would stop traffic. She was quite eccentric, obviously. She would stop traffic, and she was regarded by my parents and other under the name of Crazy Mary. And we were, as little kids, we were instructed not to be involved with Crazy Mary. And I remember someone was visiting my parents, and they had brought their little girl with them, and we were out and on the corner of Eleanor Street and so forth, and there was Crazy Mary, and I said, "Let's get going," and I took her by the hand and rushed her home, But those were childhood memories, and I remember another occasion that there was a young man whose grandmother lived in the same apartment building that we did at that time, and he took me out to Woods Lake, and then just abandoned me at Woods Lake, and I couldn't swim, and I didn't have much to do at Woods Lake, so that was kind of a miserable afternoon just watching the other kids have fun. And those are a couple memories. I remember kindergarten and second grade. I don't know how many years you want to advance into this type of thing. We moved again after I'd gone into the public schools, and I had a lot of friends there. Up to this point, being an only child, I didn't have anyone in my family much to play with, and generally in the neighborhoods where we were, there weren't any children my age. So it really wasn't until I got to what was Parkwood School in Kalamazoo in 5th grade that all of a sudden I had an abundance of people to go into the empty lots and play football if that was the season, or softball if that wasn't the season, and somehow or other I got appointed captain of the safety patrol, and which had kids at every corner to steer the other kids across the street so that they wouldn't get hit. And that was kind of a big moment. It was the only appointed office in the school. And Captain D. Williams used to come along in his squad car and pull up and ask me how things were going, you know, and I'd tell him fine, and had a lot of fun in those days.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Kalamazoo College.
What'd you major in?
Very good college. Actually, at that point in time, dollars were very tight, and because that was, well, the Depression was still on before World War II, and at that time it was usually you would go maybe to a local college for 2 years, and then my thought was after 2 years I would go to the University of Michigan to finish up. But it turned out that when I got back from the war, I was taken into the Army about my my junior year before it was over. And so I finished up at Kalamazoo College because I had more credits there. And that turned out to be fine. It was a good college, and still is an outstanding college. I'm always happy to support it.
Great. Tell us about your Army experience.
My what?
Your Army experience.
Well, again, in 1942, the enlisted reserve became available, and at that point, the theory was that you could stay in college then until you graduated and then go into the service. So in summer of 1942, unless there was an emergency. In 1942, I signed up for the enlisted reserve to get my last 2 years at college, and somehow the emergency arrived in April the following year, 1943. I thought a national emergency might mean that the German troops were landing in New York, but it seemed that the national emergency arrived a little earlier. And so I went into the Army, was interviewed, went out for basic training in Fort Warren, Wyoming, and again was interviewed, and that was a quartermaster camp for basic training. And so I had to go to some quartermaster school for a specialty, and they had schools on administration and refrigeration and all variety of things. People think that in the Army everyone is there with a gun because that's what we see the pictures of, but everybody has to be fed, they have to be moved, equipment has to be moved and bought, purchased, brought in, office records had to be kept, there was welding had to be done, there was a welding school, and so interesting, I guess, with my college background and so forth, my interviewers suggested I get into administration, which would be company office or something. And at any rate, I left him, and then the assignments were all then posted on a board later in the day, and I was number 110. So I looked over to find out what 110 was, and it was an automotive mechanic. So I went back to my interviewer, and I said, you know, I think a mistake has been made. I don't know a carburetor from a transmission, you know. And he said, well, I'm sorry, but 70% of everybody going through today is going to be an automotive mechanic. So I went to automotive mechanic school, And I found it pretty interesting, a 4-cycle engine, and we ran a test where we had to break one down, put all the parts on the floor and pull them together, and put them together, hook up a can of gasoline and time it, and at any rate, so then I was sent to advanced shop foreman school in Omaha, Nebraska. And from there, I went to Camp Edwards, Massachusetts, out in Cape Cod, and assigned to a company, a medium automotive maintenance company. An amazing thing happened there. We ran a motor pool, and I was transferred out of the shop and the automotive into the motor pool office, where we received all the vehicles coming into the camp, and if they needed repair or anything, that was what my company did. But in the meantime, we ran a motor pool. There were 4 of us. And then the time came that we were ready to go to Europe. And so we went to, took the ship over to Normandy in France, and then we sat there for a while waiting in an apple orchard until about a month, and we were assigned to 3rd Army, General Patton's Army. And we were assigned, interestingly, not to do automotive work. We were going to run a motor pool. We had a company meeting brought together now that we had taken on running the forward motor pool for 3rd Army. We weren't doing mechanical work any longer. So we had a company meeting, and we were informed of this, and I remember the commanding officer said, to the point was that we're now running the motor pool for 3rd Army, which would be a mobile motor pool, and that there are only 4 people here who know how to run a motor pool. We have Garaventi, Odom, McAllister, and Polzin, and they are in charge. Rank is forgotten. As far as we were concerned, when rank opens up in the table of organization, which would be a little bit more pay, that we would get whatever rank might open up, but at the moment it was full. But that was all right because we had certain perks. We had separate quarters. We went, I think the 4 of us took a GMC truck and went through this German town and found buildings that the Germans had evacuated, and we picked up furniture and fitted our bedroom and took care of things very well. And so we had a nice position working with the different armored divisions. Our job was, again, to get vehicles, if necessary, repair them, and or if they were new, just be the ones who transferred them over to the various divisions. We kept track daily, which was interesting, of battle casualties. Not battle casualties in the terms of people, but in terms of vehicles. And the battle casualties were our authorization to issue a vehicle. We were relatively safe, relatively, at least from hand-to-hand combat. We were strafed quite often, and planes came over quite regularly. And so you would hear them or see them from a distance, and you'd run for shelter, and the buildings might get strafed or something that you were around. But if you were reasonably cautious, and we were, you could take care of yourself. And we carried on moved a few times because it wasn't easy to move because we had to move all those vehicles. And we ended up the war in Nuremberg. After Nuremberg, the war was now over, so our company was transferred to Marseille for direct shipment to the Pacific. So we were down there cosmolining, which was sort of grease, all our equipment and so forth for the sea weather and the water, and we would be going down, I guess, through the Mediterranean into the Red Sea and eventually work our way, which was, I think, going to be something like 2 to 3 months to the Pacific. Fortunately, in August, Japan surrendered, so that was discontinued. During the time that we were in Marseille, we were visited from SHAFE headquarters, which was the European headquarters in Paris, by a group that were doing interviews of people in different companies. These interviews were done on a wire recorder, which was the first kind of recorder before we had tape recorders. Were done on a wire recorder and then separated and sent home to the local radio station of the soldier who had been interviewed as a method of saying, well, this is why I'm on my way to the Pacific, although I'm quite happy about it, and we're all right, and to build some of the morale up on the home front. I was interviewed, and they said, have you ever done any radio or theater work or something? And your voice was very good. And I said, yes, I did in college and in school. And they said, well, how would you like to do some of these interviews, which were scripted, and then also help write them for other companies, because part of the interview was telling where your company had done and what had been, and they did other companies besides ours. So I did that for about 3 or 4 weeks, and at the end of that, they said, well, how would you like to come up to SHAFE headquarters in Paris? Well, that sounded pretty good, but by that time, the war had now ended, and I thought, well, we'll be going home. So I said, well, thank you very much, but I don't think so. And so the next thing, we got the word that we were being split up and divided, but all of us were heading back to Germany for other duties, such as bomb disposal and so forth. And so I remember, so then I got a quick weekend leave, and I went to Paris and hunted up a friend of mine who had gone over there. And Don said, well, this division is all filled up, but let's go around and see if there is some other opening here at SHAFE headquarters. And we did find one. There was a man who had enough points, and you went home on the number of points that you had accumulated, which were months overseas and how many battle stars you had and so forth. And so this particular man was due to go home, and he was one who had worked with making contracts for materials or food or whatever it was with French companies, and those contracts were being terminated, and somebody was needed to replace him, and they thought I could do that. So I got back to Marseille from Paris, and when I was checked in, they said, well, I see you've been busy in Paris, and we're waiting for your orders. So I got myself ready, and the orders never came, and they never came. So I called this sergeant I had dealt with in Paris, and he said, well, as a matter of fact, he said, I told him it was of essence because I'm about to leave to go back to Germany unless we get these orders through. And he said, the situation is that everybody's busy counting their points and we aren't being very active. And so I went back to Germany and went with a bomb disposal group. And we didn't have a huge amount of labor to do because we had German prisoners to do the work for us, and we had DPs, displaced persons, and so I was there, and eventually our company moved to just outside Paris, so I did get to Paris, and then by that time another battle star, which was worth 5 points, had come in, and I remember I was in Paris for the weekend, and a friend of, in fact, my roommate there in a chateau that we were living in came and found me one night there at a nightclub in Paris, and he said, they want you back at the company right away. We're going to send you home. And my response was, well, Jack, I said, you know the Army, I can go back, but I'm all set here Saturday night and Sunday, and I'll come back Sunday night. And he said, okay, but he said, I have a Jeep and a driver out here, so don't tell him I ever found you. And I'll go looking for you some more places. And then the next day at Rainbow Corners, which was a GI gathering point that had coffee and donuts and place to recreate in Paris, I heard about a ship that was leaving for the States the coming week, so I interrupted my Sunday afternoon and caught the train back to the little town where the chateau we were living in was, and by gosh, within 2 weeks, I was on board the ship, across the ocean, checked into New Jersey, off to Camp Atterbury in Indiana, and in 2 weeks to that Saturday, I was walking the streets of Kalamazoo.
Very good. So did you go back to school right away then, once you got back?
Yeah, that was, I got back in January, and so I made the February semester and started the February semester and finished that, and then I would have had enough credits to graduate probably about the next February or so, or at least quit going to school, but there were some courses that I thought were rather interesting that weren't part of my majors, and I took some of those and graduated with the class in June.
So what were your first jobs after you got out of school?
After I got out, well, I've got to backtrack a little of that. I had a number of jobs, from paper mill jobs and so forth, but my father at that time was with an extract company. He was general manager of it in Battle Creek Extract Company in the flavoring business. And so I think while I was still in school there, I had worked there, I think, 2 summers. And so then at that time, in 1941, while I was still in school, I had just started college. So I had worked there when I was in high school. I correct myself. It wasn't when I was in college. When I was in high school, I had worked there 2 summers in production, and it was a relatively medium-sized small company, and I had done formulations and had worked there. And then the company in 41 went bankrupt. That was when I first started my freshman year at college. And my father was thus out of a job. And so he decided that he would go into the flavor business. He thought that was a pretty good business to be in. Didn't have any money. A lot of promises were made when he was general manager about what was going to happen if anything happened to the company, all of which weren't kept, which was a pretty good lesson to me that things should be written down and contracts made. So he knew nothing about the manufacturing of flavorings. I had had 2 summer vacations with it, but we did have some formulations and we had some products that we could make. And so he went out on the road selling those things, and I would come after classes when I was in college. I would go down and make these things. And we were really operating on quite a shoestring there, and that's about it. We didn't have a telephone in the quarters we took up. Had 3 rooms on the 3rd floor of the Todd Building in Kalamazoo. We didn't have a telephone because nobody was calling us anyway, and at any rate, so there was much we lacked, including money, but we had a little credit. My dad had some credit. And he would go selling out there, and then I had started college by that time, so that I would come down and make the products and teach my dad how to do these things. And we got some equipment, and some in 1943 then, after 2 years of doing that, I went into the service. Our first year in business, showing you how tight we had to be on things, we did $5,100 worth of business, which in 1941, $5,000 was a lot more than it is now. I suppose that would probably be closer to 60,000 or so, I suspect, which still wasn't a lot. People are inclined to say, well, the dollar was worth more. Well, it was worth more, but when $60,000 was your gross sales, even then 5,000 was not a lot of money. But so after I graduated in 1947, and my dad limped along here and grew the business a little. It was difficult to grow a business during the war. You had to, even to buy a stainless steel bucket, you had to get a special dispensation or certification from, I think, out of Grand Rapids to do that. So after I graduated, the company had grown somewhat. It was, I think we were doing $29,000 a year at that time, you know. I went into the company. I had an opportunity, a couple other opportunities, but I thought, well, we'll go in with my dad. So we went back together into business. And that's how I migrated into the flavor business.
How did you ever come up with that concept? That's not an ordinary business or something that you hear, like starting a restaurant. How did he think about that there'd be a niche for that?
Well, we had these, from Battle Creek Extract Company, we had these original, rather simplified formulas. And then, of course, over the course of time, I went down to Purdue, and they had a course down there on flavor extractions, which it's quite similar to the perfume industry. In fact, actually, the first flavor companies past the turn of the century were essences, made essences, and flavors to a great extent are essences until you get allied compounds of them where you deal with acidity or saltiness or something that you are combining with that. But basically, a flavor is entirely an olfactory or aroma character that you work in. So it's quite allied with the perfume industry. Most of the companies back then, in fact, we didn't have flavoring companies really until into the 1900s, and they were all European firms that relatives had come to the United States and established branches of. And many of the products were made by buying concentrates, extremely strong concentrates, and then after they were from the parent companies, which might have been their family, and then diluted to the proper consistency and so forth here in the United States and for specific uses, because what you use for a bakery where you have high heat temperatures is different than you would be able to use in ice cream, where you don't have the heat problem of the volatility of the ingredients coming off. So I guess throughout the years we learned and we started becoming more basic. Originally we did buy a lot of highly concentrated compounds, maybe that were of a strength where you would say you would use 1 part to 50,000 parts. Well, no, one part to 128 parts of solvent, and then that would dilute it to a strength where an ice cream maker could use 1 ounce to 5 gallons of ice cream. And then, of course, if you added color and so forth, that would dilute that somewhat. So we really started that way with highly concentrated flavors. And then in the course of the years, as we got more sophisticated and got into developing and making these prime, if you want to call them, flavors ourselves.
So did companies come to you and say, we'd like to have this product that tastes like this, and you'd come up with the way to make it taste like that? Or did you just invent them yourself?
Well, to a certain extent, well, we had a basic line and maybe 2 or 3 different flavors for different purposes. And then what happens is that you go out and you want someone's business and they're buying from someone else, then you work to duplicate what you had, and so you've added that somewhat to your line. And you come up with really a lot of great multitude of different flavors, of different varieties of the same flavor. You know, I would say we probably had and have at this time, the company has probably 30 walnuts. I mean, there's a nuance between a black walnut and an English walnut, and then someone's black walnut may have different overtones that someone else's doesn't, and there's preferences out there, and so you duplicate it. Actually, the company has well over 100 vanillas. Now, you say, how can you have 100 vanillas? Well, first place, you can separate natural from artificial. Now, you got two groups right there. Then you can separate natural and artificial. That is, a natural blended with an artificial. Then in more recent years, I would say the last 20 years, we've come up with natural flavors that are very much like vanilla, like a pure vanilla bean, very much like it, that you could blend that natural with the other natural. You say, in fact, we bought some ice cream. Kay came back with Edie's ice cream the other day, and to make an ice cream pie for a luncheon she was having. And I noticed on the carton, you used to be able, there were very distinct laws on labeling. If it was a pure vanilla, it could be labeled vanilla ice cream. Then, if it was an artificial vanilla, you could label it had to be labeled rather, artificial flavored vanilla ice cream. If it was a blend of the two, it would be vanilla with artificial flavoring, vanilla ice cream with natural and artificial flavoring. Now it gets even trickier, I noticed, with this Edie's ice cream, because I sort of detected a character, a very nice character of a vanilla bean, a natural, but nevertheless synthetic, but all natural ingredients from different plants. I detected that in it, and I got out the labeling and looked at this, and Edie was labeling this French vanilla ice cream, and I noticed that it contained natural flavor in the contents, natural flavor, and then it said ground vanilla bean. So it left me thinking this was made with not necessarily 100% pure vanilla, but it was all natural flavor with the ground vanilla bean.
How many flavors does your company have now?
Altogether, how many formulations? Well, we had, I would say close to 1,000. And some of them, that has now changed with the company. And this has happened since I've left the company. But people ask me, are you bothered with government regulations? They are the least of our problems. The government's mainly interested in sanitation and how it's made, and they aren't deeply concerned with a lot of things. However, what has entered the food industry is that sometimes larger companies used to come and visit your plant, and they would have a set of standards of what you ought to be, how you should be operating. And then that's become such a huge thing that they've stopped doing that. And there are now organizations, 3 or 4 rather large ones, who for a fee certify you and they come in with a 500-page book about how you are to run your business. What is it in well, it doesn't matter, but it's another industry that has this type of thing, specifications. But at any rate, they're very fussy about everything. For example, I thought, and we conform to that, and then you're certified at any rate. You conform to their standards and their regulations, and they keep enlarging them all the time. Just in the, 4 years that I've been retired out of the company, they've added, we had a small waiting room, offices off of this and offices off of that, but walked in the front door, there was a waiting room with a couple benches and so forth for suppliers or customers to make themselves known, and a very obvious counter you could walk over to and talk to somebody. But that is no longer the case because of food safety, that they now demand that we put up a wall with a camera and a buzzer system, and you just can't just walk in. So my successor there, John Hinkle, said, why? And they said, well, a terrorist can walk in there. Now, we've been in business since 1941, and we haven't had a terrorist ever walk in to our business. But he said, that terrorist could come in, and there's your office, who's going to do that? That type of thing. The property we had partly fenced in. It has to be completely fenced in. It's even stipulated where your employees can enter. These things are really stretching it. When they first started this, and this has been going on now, these unaffiliated, they're called audits, and so the company you do business with, they ask who you audited by. Originally, it was not too bad. In fact, we rather liked it. In other words, we used to furnish uniforms for all our employees, which I think they had 4 uniforms apiece that we rented and were laundered, and they would wear them home and wear them to work. Well, one of the first things that had to happen, that had to be stopped, because they're wearing this home, what are they doing? Working with the manure in their backyard and so forth, and they obviously are wearing uniforms to work that were soiled at home. So one of our first motions was that we had to set up we had to get locker room space for everybody to have their locker to keep their uniforms, and that type of thing, all of which wasn't bad. If we had told our employees they no longer could do it on our own, there would have been a great deal of resentment and trouble and argument about this thing, you see. But when somebody came in and said, well, in order to be certified, you have to do this. So there was not much conversation, and everybody bought into it, the same way that every truck that comes in has to be searched for vermin and see if there's anything in there in the way of insects and beetles or something or other in every truck, and we have to write it down. The cooler the temperatures have to be checked in the coolers 3 times a day and marked on a clipboard there what time it was checked and what the temperature was. That type of thing, which was a little irritating. I thought we knew how to wash a stainless steel tank after we had used it, but we had to document how we washed it, and then when it is washed, we have to document that we did it. Because, quote, if it isn't documented, it never happened. So we're come in and are checked on that. So it is quite expensive now. So we had all these formulas, and we made things up in small batches for small customers. That has had, just in the 4 years, they have had to definitely change that. Largely because it's too expensive. The specifications that we have to run every batch through a lab and come up with all a sheet of specifications to give to the customer in terms of the pH and other aspects of the product. So they have found, just since I left, that we've got to go and re-educate the customer to use something that we're making larger batches of. We just can't make a small batch of something and take care of a small customer's own peculiar idea about this thing.
So I'm assuming it's sometime after you got back that you met your wife, Kay. Yep. When did you meet Kay?
Well, Kay was a school teacher in Kalamazoo, and she was born and raised in Kalamazoo. And she was a school teacher out at Portage Central, taught high school math. And I was in a civic play. And a gal I knew quite well in the play who was married. Well, to backtrack a little, the background is after you've been in a civic play, which may run 2 to 3 weeks, you have the closing night, and you have a green room party, and a number of things happen there, which are fun, but then it often adjourns out to some other club or something for the night, for a nightcap. At any rate, so Margaret taught with Kay out at Portage at that time, and so she brought down Kay. Well, for I and another man in the cast, she brought down 2 teachers from Portage that she worked with, and so I met Kay. Kay was assigned to the other fellow. I was assigned to the other teacher. But that's how I met her. A few months, well, that was probably in the fall, we were both on a ski trip with a group of single people up at Caberfay. And she happened to be along on that ski trip. So I re-met her. And at that time, I asked her before the weekend was over for a date for the following Saturday night. And she said, well, no. She says, no. I have promised the girls I was going to play bridge with them. So she's a person of her word. So that was that. So I forgot her. Well, it seemed that that was the year I was appointed a steward in the lodge. The master of the new master decided it would be nice for all the officers and their wives and significant others. We didn't have that type of significant other back then, or dates, but mostly the wives were all going out to the lake where there was a dance hall that did round and square dancing with a live orchestra. And so I needed a partner. I'm going to go doing round and square dancing, and Bill thought, it was Bill Schultz, by the way, who was master of the lodge, and he thought that was the way for the officers to get acquainted and know each other. And so I thought, well, I'll give that Stimson girl. Oh, I tried another girl. I called another girl, no answer. Well, I needed a date. So I thought, well, I'll try that Stimson girl again. So I called her, and she accepted, and we went. And that was, I guess, the last date with anyone else that she and I ever had. The next date was a Masonic potluck, at which time my mother made the dish for me to take. So I picked Kay up and off we went to Masonic potluck, and from there evolved our courtship and our wedding, and introduced Kay to Masonic life.
You've been active in a lot of social and civic organizations. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of them? And
Well, you have had quite a list here of things. I guess it's in phases of our life, and following somewhat your sequence, and I thought about that, is that after we got back from the service, or I got back and started work, I guess our first venture into anything, we of course skied, and we went up, skied at Cabernet, and then I had an opportunity to buy a small catamaran. And catamarans were rather new. Now they're tubular aluminum, and this was like a real boat. It was made out of wood, with two pontoons out of wood, with a cockpit out of wood centered in between, so it was heavy, and then the mast. And we bought that, and they do have, and so that was a boat that we sailed, and we had needed a place to put it, so we rented the Gull Lake Yacht Club was where the Gull Lake Country Club is, and we joined the yacht club, and then you had to have a social member at the country club, so we had that, and so we started sailing, and then we got into a real fleet, and we started having a lot of fun going to other lakes, to regattas in Lake Erie and so forth. But that's neither here nor there. But one of the things that you had listed is that I was later secretary treasurer of the Gull Lake Country Club, and also the Rebel class, which was the next boat we had, was a Rebel, and there was a national class for that I was secretary of that. But back locally, I also, before Kay, I got involved with the Kalamazoo Lassies, which was the American Girls Baseball League, which played real baseball with hard balls and played overhand. And it was started during World War II, when Phil Wrigley, who owned the Cubs, thought there was going to be a shortage of ball players, and the tickets would go down. So he went around the countryside and found the best ball players he could find of girls, and there was that movie made of them, A League of Their Own. And Kalamazoo had the Kalamazoo Lassies, and somehow I got interested in that and involved with that, and they decided to form a boosters club, and that lasted for a few years, and the 4 years or so I was president of it, but I also was we had the Society for Crippled Children in Kalamazoo, which later became Adult and Crippled Children, which later became Easter Seal. And somehow or other, I got on the board of that and worked my way through, and I was involved there. As far as also a good part of my life, with the society, a good part of my life, it was 1961. We had been married a few years, that I got an invitation to join Rotary. And I knew Rotary really had the really high quality business owners in the community, and I felt rather flattered to be invited. However, they also had an attendance rule that you had to make 70% of the meetings minimal. And then also they were meeting, well, by that time, they met on Mondays. And I thought, well, I have those to go to, and I have lodge to go to. And so I gave a lot of thought to this. I, at the same time, knew that if I didn't join then, I would never, never be asked again. So I thought, well, it's Monday, and although I was doing a lot of traveling for business, I thought, well, Monday isn't too bad. I can check down to the office and I can go through what needs to be done and start my trip on Tuesday. So if I was going off to California, instead of leaving on Monday and getting back on Thursday, I'd leave on Tuesday and get back on Friday on business. So that led to that. I somewhat got involved with Kalamazoo College in fundraising for them. Some years ago, I got involved when they started a foundation. I think the second year, the Bronson Hospital started a foundation to build one, which they have. That was about 1985 or 84, which they built. And I've been on the board of that and been president at one time and still on the board of that. As a past president, you're emeritus and you go on and on. The YMCA, I've been busy with the YMCA. That started in my youth, really. I went to Camp Ahara, their Y camp, and then I didn't see much of that type of YMCA all through after high school and then through college, the war years. But I got invited down to, a man took me down and taught me how to play handball. And I got going with a group on handball. And then a number of years ago, I was president of the board of that, and then I was on the trustees until 2 years ago when they decided to do away with the trustees and consolidate that with the actual corporate board, the work of the trustees. Those are some of the things I've done. With Rotary, they always keep you busy with that. As you have mentioned there, just this year, with a great surprise, Rotary awards a Red Rose Award, or they try to every year, to someone in the community for community service. And Kay and I received a telephone call this spring that we had been selected. And it's for, the list of the people on that is pretty awesome to me, and it need not be given to a Rotarian. And in fact, it usually isn't. It's someone that, to one way or another, has exemplified their service and their philanthropy and work in the community. So we received that, which left us really on high, and what family we have came from far parts to attend that meeting, and some awfully nice things were said, you know.
So let's talk a little bit about Freemasonry, which is an organization I know you're very familiar with. Your dad was a Mason.
Yes, my dad was a Mason. My grandfather was a Mason, the one in Chicago. And in fact, I have young memories. Most kids in Kalamazoo, roots were there, and their grandparents were on the farm. My grandparents were in Chicago. So in the summers, when they would go spend a month or so with their grandparents and get out of their parents' hair, they would go to the farm. I would go to the big city and saw the amazing things, how differently Chicago functions, you know, from the alleys with the carts going down, selling vegetables, delivering ice. You put your sign up at the window, how many pounds of ice you wanted, and then I was exposed to streetcars, to Riverview Amusement Park, and down in the Loop, and great vaudeville at the Palace Theater and so forth. But at any rate, so my grandfather was a Mason, and he was a Shriner, and he took me to the Shrine circuses when I was young kid, and my dad was a Mason. He wasn't really very active, and I have a vague memory of a couple things. Number one, in the drawer in their desk was a little black code book that said Magician's Magic Movements. And that was a ritual book with symbols in it. And I remember snooping through that desk and finding lots of things, and I'd find that book, Magician's Magic Movements and Incantations, and with all these symbols, and that was interesting. My father, also I vaguely remember, he would get charges. Evidently, I learned later they were charges for non-payment of dues during the Depression, and he obviously paid him. And I think he mentioned many times, my grandfather had said, Jack, he said, you can give up your membership in a lot of things. You can give them up at the golf club, and you can give up the Elks, and you can do this and that, but don't give up your Masonry. So I was sort of indoctrinated with that. Then, and my father never, even after I grew up, he always spoke highly of Masonry, but he never asked me to join, which was truly the culture at that time. Never asked me to join. And I was active, I said, with the Kalamazoo Lassies. Clark McKenzie, past Grand Master of Mason. He was Mr. Mason in Kalamazoo area and probably up here, and he was a sort of a master of ceremonies. He traveled all around the country, and I think when the war was over and General Patton was in Chicago, they called on Clark to come over there for a dinner and introduce him. And he was Mr. Mason, he was Mr. Republican in Kalamazoo, he was Mr. Kalamazoo College, and quite quite a mentor, really, for me. But he was also interested in the Kalamazoo lassies. And he would sit back there and had a box, he and Maud, and whenever a girl hit a home run, he had a $5 bill as they passed his box on their way from third base to home, you know. And I used to drop in to see him at his office after I got involved with Masonry. But he got me into it, really, because we had a banquet for the lassies one fall at the end of the season, and Jimmy Double X Fox was the speaker. As usual, Clark was master of ceremonies. He had a real gravelly voice. And while that meeting was on, he said, "John, I sent you something in the mail today." Well, I got the mail the next day, and I opened it up, and there was a petition. No mention that he would like me to join or anything. It was just a petition, period. So I set that on the dresser. And I was involved with a lot of things. I was in the JCs, and I was involved in a lot of things, plus working awfully hard to build a business. And so I thought about that, and I thought about my dad's attitude, my grandfather's, and I thought, well, came January, I got to do something. This has been on my dresser since the baseball season ended. I got to do something. I'm either going to either throw this away or I'm going to do something, And so I decided to fill out the petition. So that's how I got in. Then I was just fascinated by it. I had belonged to a college. I was fascinated by the initiation. These were really great ideas and great pattern of life that were presented me in that entered apprentice degree. I had a good friend, Jerry Summers, and I saw him, I think it was maybe after handball. I said, Jerry, I had the most amazing experience last night. I can't tell you about it, and I can't tell you about it, but there's that, And then to continue with Jerry, I got him kind of enough interested that, and he wasn't married yet either at that time, he mentioned to his family, good Dutch reformists, that he was thinking of joining the Masons. Well, they just had nothing to say good about that, And he could see he was upsetting his mother and father. And as he told me later, he had already left the Dutch Reformed Church and gone to the Presbyterian. He got active with that because they had a young people's group down there that was very active, particularly after the war. And he was in that, and he said, I've done enough things to upset him. He said, I went down to the library and looked up some books on Masonry, and of course they're kind of weird, those books on it, And so he didn't join, but I did. And
You joined Anchor Lodge 87. Was that your dad's lodge or Clark's lodge or both?
Pardon?
How did you come to Anchor Lodge 87?
Because that was Clark McKenzie's
That was
lodge.
Clark's lodge, okay.
And that was, not only was it a great experience getting those degrees, but also the lodge was just, filled with men in the community, Claude Wheeler and people who were just very recognizable in the community were a member of that lodge. And that didn't hurt to impress me,
So you went on and you became a Mason, you went through the chairs, became master?
Yes, in fact, in fact, it's sort of late. I evidently did work, I did quite well with my proficiency on the 3 degrees, and we went through rapidly compared to that. The lodge met at work every week, you know, and the first week was regular, and then you had an entered apprentice degree, then you had a master mason, then you had a fellowcraft. So you had 2 weeks to get proficient for that 4th week. And then you had, after that 4th week, you had the regular, you had the entered apprentice, and then you had the master mason. So, you know, a matter of 6 weeks, you were through that. And as I understand, that I was evidently good on the proficiency, so they started thinking of me as a steward. They had 5 stewards. One was the extra one because they would move up at the meetings, and then they would move one of the stewards into the junior deacon's chair as they advanced officers for the degree work. Until you were master, then you generally did all the master mason degrees. Bill Schultz and Vern Hayes came to a Lassie baseball game to see how I functioned there. We ran a souvenir store. We raised money that way, and with this boosters club that we had, and they came evidently and looked me over at this the Lassies, and then I became a steward and advanced through the chairs.
Who introduced you to Scottish Rite?
Well, I knew a lot of Scottish Rite Masons, but I went through Arlo Swope, sort of took me. He had been a DDI, I think, for 25, 30 years. He was probably a senior DDI. And he didn't live too far away from me. And he got me going into York Rite and called, he would pick me up or I'd pick him up. It was on the way to lodge. And so he got me there, but of course I knew a lot about Scottish Rite. My dad, who had been just straight Blue Lodge, after I got active in Masonry, he became treasurer of the lodge for a few years. But Scottish Rite, my dad had taken Scottish Rite, and I was York Rite. And after he took Scottish Rite, we both joined the shrine together. Then I was going to get married. And there was one ominous point of this. Weren't making a lot of money, and after I got married, I wouldn't be totally free. I guess, which was an interesting way to look at it. I wasn't going to be in charge of my purse strings entirely. So I joined Scottish Rite at that time in May, in the May reunion, and because I was getting married in December. So I thought I better do this before I get married. So that's how I happened to join Scottish Rite at that particular time. But
Who asked you to go into the Rose-Croix line? I know they have quite an interview process to get into the Rose-Croix line.
well, the Rose-Croix line was a little different than it is now. In fact, we changed it when I was senior warden. It started, it started with the master of ceremony. no, not Master of Ceremonies. What's the bottom of that? The one, the junior warden.
Of the elected line?
Yeah. We started with the junior warden at that point. Then you were junior warden, senior warden, then you were master. Then you were master of ceremonies, and then you were orator. And so the junior warden was transferred. Good man. And so I was appointed junior warden at that time to finish his term. And so, and then I guess the following year too, because it's 2 years. So that's how I started with that appointment, really.
Very good. Of all the, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Of all the appendant and affiliated Masonic organizations that you belong to, and I know you belong to a lot of them, what's your favorite?
I think I like the Red Cross.
Red Cross of Constantine?
I guess seemingly that you can't go to all these things. And there's some I just don't go to their meetings. And so I do try to make the Red Cross.
So obviously we know that you went through Grand Lodge and became Grand Master. What motivated you to become a Grand Lodge officer? Or who?
Well, Grand Lodge officers, and this is a structural thing, and I'm not so sure that it's so good the way we do it now. At that point, I think it was around Christmas, a number of Scottish Rite Masons in Kalamazoo, and I think we had 8 33rd degree Masons in Kalamazoo with the 3 lodges. They asked me to run and pledge their support. And then I received, contrary to the way that it is now, as a candidate. So we went out and got a little brochure made, and we got the support and endorsement of about a dozen lodges, Niles and some others around. And here's where it varies from the way we do it. And I think it's a structural thing that I don't know whether it's good or bad, but it's more egalitarian, obviously, where you get inspired to do it and you run for it. I was told, contrary to where they travel and travel and travel as candidates, I was told to go nowhere unless I was invited. So, the announcement was sent out with whatever background I had with other organizations, and I was only invited to 3 places. I was invited to Detroit, where they have, it's Detroit number 1 or something or other, they have a meeting of all the lodges in Detroit for a meeting, and all the candidates were invited, and we all went, and we all had an opportunity to say something at the meeting. I was invited to King Solomon's Club, and I went there, and I was invited to Manistee, which as far as I know was just pretty much the lodge or the district, you know. And so those are the only 3 places I went. why I say I don't think it's so bad to have that structure. Because I think, although we get good officers in, I think we miss a lot of people who can't take that time to run to all the stops of the Grand Lecturer and visit. I know, for example, there was a very good man who was president of the bank up in Alma that was interested. But there was no way that he could do that. I don't think Wally Kent, who was a sitting judge, could do that. I don't think I could have done that. I was busy trying to build a business to take that much time to do that. Down in Ohio at that time, and I don't know whether it's changed or not, it was suicide to even admit that you might like to be a grand officer in Ohio.
That's changed, hasn't it?
When I went to Grand Lodge as a candidate, there were people from my lodge that had little calling cards, and we invited them up to my suite, which we had at the, I forget which hotel it was, but at any rate. And I was also told I should not have any liquor at that suite. So Vern Hayes and I rented the suite, and we went over there with a coffee pot and Archway cookies. And that was our campaign. And we had, I think, 5 candidates. And, and at these visitations up there at King Solomon's Club, and I came back to Kay and said, I'm really kind of discouraged, you know. I don't know any of these people on the eastern side of the state, you know. I don't think I made a very great impression on these people, you know. And so there were, and then the curious thing about it too, my thinking was like that. There was a candidate from Pontiac, and he said, you know, I'm under a tremendous handicap. He said, people from outstate think I'm a Detroiter. And he said, the Detroit people think I'm from outstate. He said, I'm in a terrible position, you know. But that's something that obviously has an effect, our structure on that.
What were some of the highlights of your Grand Lodge experience, going through the line?
Well, I think going through the line, as I look back at it, we had a lot of Charlie Salmo, who was, we took in Ed Cole as president of General Motors at that time. Now, there was a busy man. And Charlie knew him because Charlie had a printing business, and a good part of his printing business was doing the catalogs and the manuals and so forth for General Motors. So he knew Ed Cole more than casually. And Ed Cole evidently professed an interest in being a Mason. So this was really, I think, for a long time, and it may have been the first time, that we ever made a Mason in one day. because Ed Cole didn't have 2 days or 3 days as president of General Motors, which was pretty obvious when he got there. He came with a little, and also we didn't let anyone know. We held it at the Detroit Temple in the Scottish Rite large room, which was larger than the Blue Lodge room. And no one was told about this except a few people, and yet it was filled. You know, we would have had, if it was announced, we'd have all of General Motors there, you know, that were Masons. And that would have been just an overwhelming crowd to begin with. So it was not told. And the Grand Lodge officers did the work, all 3 degrees. And we split it up. And so he came, fine gentleman. I remember I gave him the Bellicraft obligation. We changed parts around, and in the Master Mason's degree, I was jubilum, and so I have a notable part in my life of having struck a mighty blow to the president of General Motors. But an entourage accompanied him. And so he didn't rush us or anything. We spent the whole day there and most of the evening, and he made remarks. Then this entourage had been waiting all this time, 6 or 7 of them, or maybe 5 or so, at any rate. And from there, he left to a plane to go to somewhere where he was probably expected the next morning. So he was indeed a busy man.
That's great.
He was later killed in an airplane accident. He crashed an airplane. But that was certainly a notable affair. That was as a single illustration. We had a lot of good times. Bob Lake, in particular, was a delightful person. He's noted and legendary for his ritual, as I mentioned to you the other day. But he'd remember everybody's birthday, and if we were out doing a dedication, he would have ice cream and cake at the motel afterwards, and he was just a pleasure to work with and under. Other than that is the bicentennial of the United States and the Sesquicentennial of the Grand Lodge, which we started some 3 years in preparation for. And it was the year that I was going to be master that this was going to fall. I probably would have, because of my previous experiences, and usually had a theme for a year or a specific project to work on. And in fact, I was not altogether happy about the Sesquicentennial happening then, because I was imprisoned by it, by the fact that I really didn't have an opportunity to think about what would I like to accomplish in the Grand Lodge per se. Well, it turned out that this was a great thing, and I'm just delighted I did have that opportunity to do that for serve as master during that really exciting period that we had, an exciting program that we had.
Tell us just a little bit about the program.
It's hard to tell a little bit about a lot of things, but I'll try to condense it pretty well. the first thing we knew we needed money. So, and knowing it was my year, I had the cooperation of previous Grand Masters to plan this year and work on it autonomously, really, which may not happen with every person who is jealous of their year. First thing we did, I think it was 3 years before then, that would have been 1973, we made a resolution and set aside each year so much, I can't remember whether it was 25 cents a member or somewhere, it wasn't $1. And in those 3 years, and we had a much larger membership, we put together, I think, close to $50,000, which, again, in 30 years ago, 35 years ago, was a significant amount of money. So we had that as a nest egg for what we tentatively planned. We formed a commission for the Sesquicentennial. I picked what I thought were the best people I could find to serve on that commission. We had J. Fairbairn Smith. First, Vince Vader, who would share that year with me. I would be through in the middle of the year. But the planning would carry on through his year, and he was delighted with that. Had J. Fairbairn Smith, had Jack Laree, who was a bright and man and had strong leader in Scottish Rite, strong leader in York Rite. We had Eugene Abram, who was with Channel 7 in Detroit and would be good on public relations and would be good on a number of things and had good executive ability. We had, I have to refer here to some of these people. We had Bob Hochstad, who was Grand Treasurer and who was an executive with his rather large company there. He really dominated the cherry business around as in the Traverse City area. And we had Norman Rumble, who was editor of the Bay City newspaper. In addition to that, as coordinators who came to all the meetings and participated in, we had Howard Patterson, who was secretary of the Valley of Detroit, representing Scottish Rite, and then we had the three heads of the Grand Chapter of Royal Archmasons and the Grand Council, Royal and Select Masons, as well as Bill Parker, who was Grand Commander of the Grand Commander. It was an all-Masonic thing. And we met regularly for 3 years. Our goals were, hoped for goals, as I remember them, were number one, to introduce of course, to celebrate both the freedom of our founding fathers with that bicentennial aspect to it, and also to acquaint everyone, and by everyone we meant everyone, Masons and non-Masons, with the history of Masonry and their part in the founding of our country and the founding of many of our institutions, such as the University of Michigan, which some of the first money, I think, came from the Zion Lodge in Detroit, came from that lodge. So how Masonry, even the Masons should know, or at least have their knowledge renewed of the contribution that Masonry has made for the country. Overall, we resolved and stuck to it, was that this was not a Grand Lodge celebration. This wasn't a chapter or consul or Scottish Rite celebration. It was a Masonic celebration. It was not a Grand Master's celebration. That I was particularly strong about. It was not my year. My picture wasn't going to appear on anything. There were no souvenirs from me. And under that, then, so that was the commission. Under that, on the district level, we followed the Board of General Purposes level. We had those 33 districts at that time that had a committee to work on promoting both lodge events that took place, because the lodge was the core of it. As far as the lodge is concerned, they were to appoint a chairman for the lodge and a committee, and we had arranged, part of our 16 points, special months for special celebrations that the lodge should observe, from religious ones to history ones to variety thing. Also, the district was to have, again, one of those 33 among their, so we had, and we called those district people the Minutemen. And there was a colonel for the Minutemen in each district who was their literally chairman. And among other things that was designated for them, besides promoting all the other events that the lodges may be doing, they were charged to have a Washington's birthday party, a Washington dinner and birthday party and entertainment. Then it came down to the lodge level. And out of then, part of the whole program was we developed a 16-point program of things that we might do. And that was pretty much placed in the hands of different people in the Sesquicentennial Commission. As I remember, some of the more successful ones, at least I found it so, was that the lane, and this was not, every district didn't have it, but there were a number of notable people that Lewis Cass, who was our first Mason, who was a distinguished figure in American politics, William Beaumont as a physician, Houghton was, at any rate, we had about 6 of those people who we felt part of the history of this thing was to have historic markers on the highway or in the town. The regular that you've seen, historic markers, pointing out that he is a Mason and his accomplishments and so forth. And there was the district where we had these markers, and I remember one that we had up in Cass City, and we had one in Cassopolis for Cass. Both were preceded by a parade of Masons, and again, we were unified together. Everybody was working together. Like in the Army, rank was forgotten. This wasn't a York Rite parade. Commandery was there. They were all there. We worked as a group. We felt that really one of the side benefits of doing all this and bringing Masons together, working together, would be that this is something that could continue, that we have some respect for somebody else's dates and so forth, and that did continue for some time. But the marker program, where we and J. Fairbairn Smith found out what the regulations were. There was quite a few regulations to get approved by the state. There's a marker a bureau or something that he worked with that have specifications of how the markers should be, how they should be made, the height, size, and so forth. And we went to these various places up to Houghton. Every now and then somebody who's been to Houghton says, I see your name up there on a historic marker that you were up here as Grand Master of the Grand Lodge. But in any event, we had a parade to the place. We had a little ceremony for the dedication of the marker, and then we would adjourn to a pretty good-sized dinner because it was a district thing. That was one of the activities. We established a speakers bureau where we had some 40 people that we felt were very competent to go out and talk about the history of our country or Washington or similar subjects. I remember, at any rate, I had a George Washington talk that I used to give. That was part of it. So we had quite a bit of activity going on with the marker programs and with the various things. Also, every district was, no, that's the other group. Then we designated 6 districts in the state, which roughly were Detroit and Grand Rapids and Upper Peninsula and any big city, Saginaw, and down to the center. Lansing was in a separate district there. We had 6 districts that were to put on a real gala party, and that's where we used a good bulk of our money. We allocated that money for class entertainment, whether it be vaudeville, barbecues, or whatever they might do, but a real program. And that we had, in fact, I have here the programs up in Traverse City. They had 4 major acts that they brought in, and they probably, I think we probably gave them $5,000 to work with, which was a lot of money. They had the Rich Family, which was a top dance and Marinda novelty act. We had the Farrell Sisters that were a dancing and singing act. Ron Urban, who was billed as the best showman in the nation, and he excelled in his performance and seemingly with birds. And then we had a stand-up comedian that was pretty fabulous. But here was, we had, and part of that program of our 19 points was the souvenir booklet, 72 pages of history on Masonry and what's been happening in Michigan Masonry. The Sesquicentennial Commission. The big celebration was really prior to Grand Lodge in Detroit. Here were the programming. Lansing had a dance and Tommy Dorsey in his orchestra. It also had Dr. Carl Winters, who was a reverend He was a pastor, but at the same time he had been warden of a prison in Illinois, which is an interesting background. And he was a marvelous speaker that spoke on 2 occasions. One was when Lansing had their program. He spoke on what's right about America and gave a stirring address. And then that was followed by the dance where we had Tommy Dorsey's orchestra. It took the money to get those people in, you know. The big celebration was 3 days in the Detroit area, and John Downs was the chairman for that. And John literally went out to Las Vegas and picked acts and brought them back for us. And the programs I looked up were red, white, and blue, and they were quite exciting, I think. On Sunday was the Vesper service, and after the normal introductions of the Grand Master and all, the Jills of Bloomfield Hills, which was a singing group, came on, and that was followed by the Continental Strings and Eddie Schick's orchestra, whoever that was, but I presume it was from the Detroit area. And then the Lutheran choir of Detroit gave a testament of freedom. And then Carl Winters followed with his talk, What's Right with America? And then we had favorite patriotic selections and hymns by the Lutheran choir again. That was the Sunday, the Vesper service to start off. Then on Monday, we had Les Brown and his band of renown, featuring Butch Stone and Stuppy Brown and Joanne Greer. And then the show started with comedy. And I remember to this day, Don Rice, he was the comedian, and he came walking down that long aisle of the Masonic auditorium with his raincoat, trench coat over his shoulder, and he didn't say a word, didn't look side by side. He just walked up and came up at the stage and stared at the audience, and then he dropped his trench coat on the stage. That's what my kids do. And that kind of brought off the house and started his comedy. Then John had brought in a magician extra special who did all kinds of fire escapes and so forth. And then we had the Brothers and the Sisters, which was Les Brown and his band of renown that had singers and dancers with them. And then we had a surprise finale for the day. And I remember the surprise finale. It seemed simple, but it was kind of cute. There were all these balloons up on the ceiling, hundreds of balloons, and they were all dropped, and everybody was charged. While the band played, everybody was charged to keep moving the balloons backward. So the balloons would come forward, and so that whole place the finale was Les Brown playing whatever he was playing, plus those. And for the third act, the third thing, and that would have been on Tuesday, we had the Muslim Shrine Temple Band, and Josiah Penberry was the master of ceremonies, and we had some historical highlights of Masonic history that were given by Dave Vokes, and then we had the presentation of the 15 Masonic presidents that we had. And they chose men who perhaps looked somewhat like the presidents, and then we had a collection of all the First Ladies' gowns that are in the Smithsonian Institute. Now this was classic. And women with those, on. And they came down, and then again, we had a presentation of the Masonic bodies and by the Muslim Temple Shrine Band, and then the Legion of Honor was given, and then the flag, 50 flags of our states were presented in mass, and a final was a salute to America. And it was just a great 3 days.
Sounds like it. Well, we need to kind of...
I might add to that, as one of our purposes was to get people united and get the Grand Lodges, all the bodies of Masonry, Eastern Star, and everyone were included in all of this, as far as on committees and so forth. It did end up that after the subsequent to all this, and the year was over, the next year, all these bodies, Scottish Rite, York Rite, and all these people signed what was written up as a covenant of cooperation, that from now on we would thus work together as we had for the planning, the production, and the carrying out of this celebration. And that, I think, stood for quite a while. We had a single calendar, which was one of the major things. We had a single calendar, and the heads, the state heads, insisted on this, that their things be on the calendar, and the dates were established, so we didn't have conflicts.
I have just one or two more things I want to wrap up with.
Okay.
One of them is, I know you've known a lot of grandmasters over the years. Who were your favorites, or who impressed you the most of all the grandmasters that you've known?
Well, I think that I'm going to cheat a little and look at those grandmasters that I had. I guess that I was, of course, I was Grand Marshal for my first Grand Master. And Bill Harmon was Grand Master at that time. And Bill came out of York Rite, and Bill was an interesting person. Bill was a pastor, and I think he had, from Sheboygan, and I think he had 2 small churches. So he would quit Saturday night when we had a lot of things on the weekends, and he would drive back to Sheboygan on Saturday night. He was committed to this. And also, he was a partner in some little electrical business up there, too. So out of it all, he fashioned a pretty good living, I think. But he was really a very solid Mason. And I remember sometimes people by phrases that he would say more often than not when people were irresponsible about things for any variety of reasons. He would roar back, you know, convenience has nothing to do with duty. And that sort of stuck with me along the years. But I remember Charlie well, and Bob Lake I mentioned before. I had a great association with Will Adams and Royce Curlis, both good people, and myself, because we had a pact together besides this celebration commission. We had a pact that none of us would be promoting anything that all 3 weren't in agreement with. If we were going to do something, let us all 3 get involved with it. We decided at that time, and this was prior because both of those people preceded me, I think it was in Will Adams's year, we decided that we would have continuity in Masonic education. And out of the blue, I never met him before, Dick Sands. Somebody knew about Dick Sands, and they invited Dick Sands up. And I think we met at Will Adams's cottage up on Torch Lake and went over what he had to offer about what he thought could be done on Masonic education. But the three of us, we said for at least 3 years, we aren't going to have things change every year. The celebration you're working on, John, that's your baby, but all three of us are going to be committed on what the others want to do and get it started and get it done, and we did. And we had good continuity there. Bob Osborne, I would point out, who was probably as well grounded in every way in Masonry and knowledgeable and really quite very brilliant man, really, and very bright and very outstanding. And then Carl Warfel, who was a friend of mine up here in Grand Rapids. He was generally quiet about most things, and one thing that all of these people impressed upon me when I was Grand Master: don't make edicts, because they'll get you in trouble every time. Just don't make edicts. And wiser people ahead of them I listened to. And Carl Warfel, he was very approachable, very friendly, and at the same time, he had the courage. Sometimes foolhardy courage will get you into trouble, but sensible courage doesn't. Large temples were having a huge problem in regard to liquor. And for example, Detroit Temple, which had Ford Motor Company every year, would have a large meeting there and banquets and so forth. They couldn't have liquor for it. And that happened with Grand Rapids Temple also. They wanted to lease out the temple for something, and they couldn't serve liquor. And so Massachusetts had introduced it with very strict guidelines under what conditions they do. And Carl Warfel had the courage, after he got in office, to simply declare, we are having liquor in temples under these restrictions. And he had a whole year for people to get used to it, because we would take it up at meeting after meeting after meeting, and you would get, God bless them, some little temple who would stand up, and somebody would stand up and say, you know, I was here when this temple was dedicated, with all its rooms and its appurtenances, and it was dedicated to God. And that just moved the whole motion down. So those are the ones that I served with that I remember the others that performed their duties well, but those stand out as very good years, I think, for Grand Lodge.
And then my last question is, what advice would you have for a young Mason? What would you tell a young Mason today?
Well, I guess I may have touched on some of those favorite things. I think a Grand Lodge officer should start perhaps thinking of his year when he's going to be master, Grand Master, in terms of really what constructive things can he put forth a program to do. And then, back to what I said, talking that over with and working with his other Grand Lodge officers particularly. I think it's tremendously important to really have lasting friendships with your fellow officers that go on past that. It's even on the Blue Lodge level. Bill Schultz, who appointed me as steward, Vern Hayes, Ed Prince, who was a master that you may not be familiar with at that time, and Ken Hamill, who was a master of my lodge. All of us in line became lasting friends. And our wives. We spent 28 New Year's Eves together. We necessarily didn't see each other all that much collectively during the year. We weren't constantly together, but we were working at Masonry somewhat together. But I think if you can get your relationships going with your fellow Grand Lodge people, if they'll let you, that's a key to a successful year, and then have some programs that are going to be valuable and not just window dressing and things, which I see a lot of sometimes.
Well, John, it's been a pleasure.
And think, and put Masonry first, just as we did in that. It didn't matter, Scottish Rite, Oh, another thing I might just, which also I think was very effective in that. We came up with little newspaper boxes, 2 columns wide and about 4 inches deep, that gave briefly and succinctly a variety of Masonic principles that we stood for. And we had 40 newspapers who those appeared in on a periodic basis. And I think that got a lot of attention. And in some cases, there were even some special sections in some newspapers on Masonry that triggered that. I think the Detroit Free Press had a special rotograph your section. That's off the train of your thinking here.
Sorry.
But,
John, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. You're one of my favorite Grandmasters.
Well,
so
thank you.
It's good to have you
Thank
with
you.
us. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this interview. If you know of a Michigan Mason who has an interesting story to tell, we'd be interested to hear about him. Our contact information will follow on this screen. If you'd like to know more about Masonry, we invite you to visit our website at masonichistory.org and the links provided there. And if you'd like to visit the Michigan Masonic Museum and Library, you'll find us in the Grand Rapids Masonic Center at 233 East Fulton Street. Our public hours are from 11 o'clock a.m. to 6 o'clock p.m. Monday through Friday. Again, thank you for watching and for your interest in Masonry.